less than 2 months away from the 2018 NFL regular season. Oh, thank you, sweet Jesus. July is so boring once it's only baseball on the calendar. And a few years ago, I did some fantasy football related videos that hopefully some of you were able to find helpful, but I felt like it was time to circle the wagons again and talk a little bit more about fantasy football and come to you and offer some guidance, some help, some assistance, because some of you may need a little bit of it, and frankly, some of you need a whole hell of a lot of it. So without any further ado, I present to you 10 fantasy football draft mistakes to avoid. Number 1, and this seems like such a basic fundamental thing, but it has to be said all the time. Don't forget to be at your draft. If you signed up for the stinking league, take note of the date, take note of the time. We take our phones into the crapper with us. They have the internet. Be at your draft. If you have to trust auto drafting to build your team, you will ultimately lose time after time after time. So if you sign up, show up to your draft. Don't do a draft until after at least week 3 of the preseason. Why would you do it? I see people talking about doing drafts at the end of July and the early and mid portion of August. What the hell are you doing? Why would you do it so early when you just don't have to? Why wouldn't you want to minimize the potential impact of crippling, long-term, potentially season-ending injuries in the preseason with the guy that you took in round 1 or round 2? Why not wait and see what happens? Why not wait till you actually have something to go off of on the field? Depth chart performance. Yes, sometimes preseason can be fool's gold, but sometimes it can be an indicator of what's coming up in the season to come. If you're thinking about joining a league and they're talking about drafting the first week of August, here's what you do. Don't! Find a league that waits until after week 3 of the preseason, because that way you know you're in a league where they know what the hell they're doing. Number 3, and there's absolutely no excuse for this in an internet age, don't forget to do some research. Look ahead of time and go online and find out average draft position for these players. Look to see where they're getting drafted, who's maybe going too high, who's going too low, who could potentially be a steal for you. Some of these websites offer mock fantasy football drafts. Participate. What the hell? It's fake. It doesn't count. You can try all types of different scenarios. You can role play and do all this other kinky type of fantasy football stuff. Pay attention to depth charts, injury reports, preseason performance. The bottom line is you have all this information, this wealth of information when it comes to fantasy football, potentially at your fingertips. You're a fool not to use it. Do some research. Oh, also as far as research goes, look at the settings and scoring for the league before you do your draft. Is it standard scoring? What roster positions do you have available? How many total rounds are there going to be for the draft? Is it half a point PPR? Is it a full point PPR? Are there individual defensive players? It's astounding to me how many people join a league, and you can tell based off of their draft strategy that they didn't bother to look and see the scoring and the settings for the damn league. Why would you go into something without trying to figure out the rules of the game first? So we're fans and we live for our teams. We love our teams, and because we're sick human beings, sometimes it feels like we die for our teams. But do not draft according to team affiliation, team loyalty, especially if your team stinks. If you don't know the names of other players in the league and who's good or who's bad, maybe fantasy football isn't your bag right now. But if you do, and you just draft a bunch of players from your own team, you're going to get burned. And not only will you get burned when your team loses, you will also get burned when your team loses and your fantasy football team absolutely sucks. Number 5 is something I'm always big on. Don't draft your quarterback too early. It just doesn't make any sense. I understand the thought of wanting to get the top 1 or 2 or 3 at the position, but why would you take a quarterback in the top 3-4 rounds when you just don't need to? Like even when you look at last year in standard scoring formats, Russell Wilson was the #1 fantasy quarterback. Jared Goff was number 12. Yes, there was about a 90-point difference between the two, but take that over 16 weeks. You're talking about 5.5 points per week difference. It's not that much. It's really not, especially when you consider Jared Goff was not the 12th ranked quarterback in fantasy football last year. Most certainly was not the 12th drafted quarterback. In a lot of leagues, he wasn't even drafted at all. So what happens is you take a guy like Russell Wilson those first 3 to 4 rounds and you pass up on all this valuable depth at running back, wide receiver, and tight end when you just don't need to. Go value wherever you can go value. And you can go value at the quarterback position, especially with the number of teams that throw the ball a lot in today's NFL. You can find you a quarterback that gives you decent points and in the process accumulate a massive amount of depth that can help you in terms of flexibility and roster strength, trade ability, all throughout your fantasy season. Don't draft a quarterback too early. Let other people dive in on those quarterbacks. Sit back and wait. You look at guys like Trubisky or Mahomes this year. Those are guys that could potentially be top 12 or 15 fantasy quarterbacks when all is said and done, and they're not going to be drafted like it. Why sit there and overdraft a quarterback when you run the risk they might not be 1, 2, or 3, where you could potentially find a steal and they vastly outplay their draft position? Also, don't draft 2 quarterbacks. If your league allows you to only carry 1 quarterback, then do that. When you start overthinking about bye weeks and crap, this is where you start to waste draft picks when you don't need to. It's a wasted roster spot that you just don't need to eat up, and it leads to overanalyzing just for the sake of having coverage for a bye week that's a month, month and a half, 2 months down the road. And I promise you, more often than not, the guys, the gals that sit there and draft 2 quarterbacks when you could only play 1 and are only required to carry 1 on your roster, all they end up doing is overanalyzing, overthinking, and leaving a massive amount of points on the bench throughout their fantasy football seasons because they took 2 quarterbacks and they only should have drafted 1. Don't draft a running back in round 1 if you can at all avoid it. Just don't. You look at last year and you look at ADP, average draft position for the running backs. The guys that primarily went in round 1 were David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell, LaShawn McCoy, Devontae Freeman, Melvin Gordon, DeMarco Murray, Ezekiel Elliott. Kind of honestly a mixed bag, especially if you take out Elliott because of the suspension specter that was hanging over him that eventually came to be. Sure, you've got studs in there like Le'Veon Bell. McCoy had a solid season. Freeman had a solid season. Gordon had a really good season. DeMarco Murray was okay, but eventually it felt like he was getting usurped by Derrick Henry. David Johnson broke his wrist in week 1 and was out for the rest of the season. All the while, after round 1, you found guys like Todd Gurley, Kareem Hunt, Alvin Kamara, Mark Ingram, Leonard Fournette, Jordan Howard. Imagine if you sat there and drafted a wide receiver in the first round and then came back in the next 2 rounds and you got, let's say, Todd Gurley, Leonard Fournette, or Todd Gurley, Kareem Hunt, or you were able to get an Alvin Kamara later on. The point I'm getting at here is while it's nice if you have, especially in a PPR league, a running back that gets the dominant amount of touches in the team's offense and catches the ball out of the backfield, it's just not something you should feel like you have to be forced to do because there is a lot of value in the running back position later on in the draft. And frankly, I would rather get the star wide receiver first than I would that star running back because so many studs are available later on at the running back position. Here's what I want you to do. If you're in a fantasy football draft and you're somewhere around round 9 or 10, it's 16 rounds, and you get that urge, that sensation that you've got to draft a defense/special teams, I want you to take your foot and kick yourself in the dick. Because it's ridiculous. Don't do it. There is absolutely no reason to draft a defense/special teams until the second to last round or even the last round. Just don't do it. I look at last season. You had the Saints and the Bears, their defensive units. Probably weren't drafted in the vast majority of leagues, and they ended up being top 10. The difference between the 3rd and 12th ranked defense/special team was less than 3 points in a week. That's not that much in the grand scheme of things. All the while, if you were the dumb dick that sat there and drafted that defensive unit in the 8th round, you could have given up so many other points from so many other positions. And it's not like people are going to want to trade for defense and special teams. And frankly, a lot of times you draft these defense and special teams units in the middle rounds of the draft. You end up releasing them anyways when they're on their bye week because you're desperate for damn points. All the while, you're trying to chase these big weeks that are too far and few between when you've got lots of defense/special teams units that can give you steady, consistent points week in and week out. And frankly, every week when you go to your league's waiver wire, you can find a defense or two that has a pretty good matchup. Just don't draft a defense before the end of your draft, period. Speaking of positions you don't draft until the end of your draft. And again, I'm going to repeat that. You don't draft until the end of your draft kickers. The difference between kicker 1 and kicker 12 last year was about 2.5 points a week. Is that really worth chasing in the middle of your damn draft? A kicker! Knowing you're probably going to cut him on his dang bye week anyways. Who in the hell spends a mid-round pick on a kicker? Oh, I can't get burned and lost in the shuffle of the wave of idiots drafting kickers in rounds 8, 9, and 10. There are winning strategies and losing strategies to fantasy football drafting. And you can take a guess by now where drafting a kicker before the last round fits on that spectrum. It's a losing strategy. Don't do it. It's dumb. Sticking with the defense, special teams, and kickers theme, the last fantasy football draft mistake to avoid. Don't draft 2 of them. These are roster spots that are wasted. It can go to additional depth at the running back, wide receiver, tight end positions. You're just going to sit there and be stuck in a position where you're overanalyzing, and more often than not, you're going to be wrong. You're leaving points on the bench, and you're just doing this so you can cover bye weeks that are 2-3 months potentially down the road. If your league does not force you to carry 2 defenses, carry 2 kickers, then carry 1 of each and then don't draft them until the end of your damn draft. There you have it. My 10 fantasy football draft mistakes to avoid. And the bottom line is you might look at me as some random jabloke on the freaking internet. But I make you this assertion. This guaranteed. You listen to me, you go to your fantasy football league playoffs. You don't listen to me, your sorry-ass fantasy team is never heard from again.